All right, welcome everyone. I hope you've had a wonderful Tuesday morning so far. But today we're going to be talking about working with survivors and also secondary victims. All right, so of course, when working with survivors, everyone has received the packets that you will do at the emergency orientation with the hospitals. And inside that is information on safety planning. So we are going to go over that, what it looks like and how to do that very briefly when you are at the hospitals, and then have a deeper understanding into the certain barriers to reporting so that you as an advocate can understand why survivors may choose to not report, um, as well as being there for them to provide options, okay? And then occasionally you will have to work with secondary victims. This could be friends or family that accompany the survivor. And so how do you be there for them, active listening with them as well, because they will have their own feelings about the situation. And so being able to know how to work with those secondary victims as well. Okay. So when we talk about safety planning, a safety plan is exactly a personalized, practical plan, okay? And so this is a plan that can help a survivor make sure that they maintain safety or at least reduce the risk of harm and increase protection so that there's not further harm, okay? The aim is to actually help survivors identify what the risks are. We know that it is very challenging and very dangerous when actually choosing to leave. So we want to help identify what those risks look like, how to minimize those risks, and explore certain strategies to enhance their safety. Recognize that safety is relative and it depends on the survivor's perspective into how they feel safe. Okay. Some may not think that safety is a huge risk. You may get those that don't feel like they need to have a safety plan. And so, but we always will suggest that it's better to have a plan in place than to not have a plan at all. Okay. In addition to safety, it's always changing. So just because you may work out a safety plan with the survivor, it's not set in stone. It could always change. Um, and so what works today for that survivor may not work tomorrow. So keep that in mind. So safety planning is very important, okay? It is going to prepare survivors for different scenarios. In the event that maybe, there's a violent incident in the home, what can they do? How can they be technology safe? How can they be emotionally safe? So every situation will be different, okay? And so there may be safety planning depending on the relationship that the survivor has with the offender. So safety planning for an acquaintance, this could be a dating partner or intimate partner, anyone that's there in a relationship with a family person. It's going to look a lot different than safety planning with a stranger assault, right? And so what we aim to do is to empower survivors to make informed decisions about their own safety, okay? Remember, this is a collaborative approach, and um, survivors have the lead. All right, whoever has their phone off, can't you please mute it? Thank you. All right, and then also help survivors navigate certain barriers because we know that sometimes survivors do have certain challenges with accessing certain services as well. So the key takeaway is to understand that safety planning is a survivor-centered process, and it's going to adapt to that survivor's individual needs and whatever their circumstances is. So there are certain factors that will influence how we safety plan with a survivor, okay? And some of their needs can depend on, of course, that relationship, right? Someone that they know versus someone that they don't know. It also can depend on their living situation. So if they are living alone, the safety planning may be different. Or if they have children that they need to make a plan with as well, that's going to look different. Or even if they actually are living with the offender, okay? We also need to understand that there are certain legal protections available. Okay. So if someone does have a restraining order, what does that mean? How do they plan if the restraining order, protective order has been violated? Okay. What are legal protections as far as shelters? How can you get to shelter? What shelters in your area are available for you? Okay. And then, of course, law enforcement. Where would you go if you needed to contact law enforcement? If you needed to contact maybe the crime victims liaison, what are the numbers for that? If the crime happened, let's just say Harker Heights PD, you will want them to have that specific information as opposed to KPD if they live in Harker Heights. So making sure it's specific. In addition to access to resources. So we know a lot of barriers that happen with survivors is because of financial instability. So that can take a great influence into if a survivor may choose to leave or not. Having the financial means makes a difference in whether they can choose to leave a situation if that's even an option, or if they don't have the means, then that can definitely be a barrier as to why they stay. Okay. And so your aim is to make sure that they stay safe within the parameters of what they decide is best for them in their situation. Okay. Access to services like housing. Okay. So, what are some options there? And then, of course, transportation. When it comes to mental and physical health, someone who has disabilities, you may have to be specific with that, making sure that they are getting their needs met, they have access to certain areas versus a person that is an able-bodied person. They can just go out their front door, that may not have any steps. If they are in a wheelchair bound or mobility issues, it may look different in how they are able to get away as well as emotional well-being. So, what are some challenges that may impact safety planning? Of course. So, racism, poverty, and even a lack of education for survivors can create barriers. Okay. There could be a distrustfulness when it comes to just the system because a person may have experienced a lot of racism. Okay. Poverty, not being able to have the means to be able to get from point A to point B, right? Language barriers. So, of course, having to make sure the survivor has a translator. They may call the police because of the incident, and then the police that get there doesn't necessarily speak Spanish or speak the language that is native to them. And so being able to articulate and get the law enforcement officer to understand that. So that could be a definite barrier with the safety planning too. Like, hey, where can I go? How do I get access to services? Okay, or even survivor resources. There is a fear of legal or government systems. So especially if the survivor, let's just say their home country, they experienced a lot of either past discrimination or mistreatment, or they found like law enforcement was, unethical, that can lead to mistrust of certain authorities. Okay. So when that happens, keep that in mind that their experiences matter. Okay. Also, sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay. LGBTQ plus survivors may face additional stigmas, especially if they are, trans or whatever the case may be. Feeling safe to be able to contact without judgment can be very hard for them, where they may not feel, where they have a safe place to go or a safe, they feel supported in contacting anyone else. Then there's geographical isolation, especially those that live in rural areas. They have fewer services and, of course, access to those services and longer response time from law enforcement are definite factors as well. So the key takeaways just to understand that, as you can see, there's so many different challenges. Each survivor's experience is very unique, and you have to cater the safety planning to those individual circumstances. So we talked briefly about safety planning from different relationships that happen. So if the offender is actually an intimate partner, these are certain scenarios on how you can explain safety planning. So if they know the actual perpetrator, we can help them to create an escape plan, identify what some safe places that they can go in an emergency. Is there a friend, preferably not a mutual friend that knows the offender? Okay. Have a list of their emergency contacts ready. So what are a list of some trusted friends, family, or even important hotline numbers? Packing that emergency bag. So that would include having their important documents, at the very least, copies of those documents. If they have a vehicle, having an extra set of keys, and then maybe some money, maybe a burner phone that could work as well. Have them understand that using technology very cautiously. So they need to learn to turn off their location and then also use certain safe communication methods. And then consider legal protection. So, of course, offer and explain to them that they do have the right as a victim to be able to obtain a protective order or a restraining order if they feel that it's needed. Okay. But if the offender is a stranger, so this is someone that they don't know, now they need to look and be very cautious, aware of their surroundings, right? They may want to avoid certain isolated areas that, they may not be able to have certain protections or be unsafe. They have to learn to trust their instincts. So if they feel a certain type of way or they feel unsafe, then they need to leave immediately, okay? They could also use that technology for safety. So share your location with that trusted family or friend, right? And then, of course, safety in groups. So staying safe with supportive people, avoid being alone, in those vulnerable situations. Now, if the survivor has children, of course, we want to discuss those emergency plans and how they can actually encourage their children to understand what those plans are, but also know when to call for help. Okay. Also, making sure that they have a safe place where you may have a friend that they may have a space for them and their children, a trusted friend, relative, or even shelter where they can stay, and of course, preparing those essential. So as you can see, the different scenarios, it is catered. The safety plan is catered. It is not a one size fits all, and it's based off the relationship with that offender. So we kind of talked about the barriers, but I also want to talk about how advocates can help. So for you as a survivor, knowing what these systemic challenges are, we need to acknowledge what those barriers are without judgment, okay? And remember, everything is from the survivor's perspective. Learn how to connect survivors with those specialized resources that they may need, and then offer solutions that are respectful to their cultural background, okay, and their lived experience. If they may not feel comfortable specifically with working with law enforcement, they may want to go to a rape crisis center and get services there. Provide flexible survivor-led support, okay, because they are the expert of their lives and they know their situation best, okay? So making sure you understand that effective safety planning must address those systemic barriers. All right, now how can you support them? Okay, so of course, provide options. Okay, remember, client autonomy is very important. They have to feel like they have the choice in the matter. Our job is not to tell them what they should do, but to provide options, not directives. The survivor will always have the final decision. Okay, identify what those risks are. Okay, so if the risk is, hey, I'm still currently living with the survivor, going back home, it may look like that, but not going back home. Let's just say if the survivor has pets, they know if I don't go back home, then, the perpetrator may choose to abuse my animals. So understand what those risks are to help them assess those immediate dangers. And then explain what those available resources are in the community, and then respecting the survivor's autonomy. So what are some questions that you can ask survivors when you are safety planning? Because of course, like we said, it's very catered. So what concerns do you have about your safety? Okay. Do you feel safe going to a possible shelter in your area? Do you feel more safe getting out of this area? It caters to what that survivor needs. Okay. Do you even have a safe place you can go? Some really struggle with having any type of supportive system, especially in those intimate partner relationships. They may have had mutual friends, of course, the family, they may not feel like, with their family that they have a safe place to go. So keep that in mind too. Who can you trust to help you in an emergency? So having them think about who is somebody that you really feel you can trust that will make sure that you stay safe and keep that safety. Okay. What steps have you already done to protect yourself? Some have already started, and some are like, hey, okay, yeah, I've already got a plan. Go over that plan. Okay, all right, that's great. Sounds like you have what you need. We just want to make sure that you do have a plan in place. And then, of course, what barriers make safety planning difficult for you? Okay. Some survivors may not have an active phone. Okay. So, how can we call for help if we don't have a phone? Right. And so, address what those barriers are and how they can overcome or even empower themselves to be able to have certain options to those barriers. Remember, your role is to empower, support, and guide, not make the decisions for them. So final thoughts when it comes to safety planning. Remember, it's an ongoing process. This is not, sometimes a one-time conversation or a one-time situation. Just understand that survivors' needs can change as well as the safety plan can change as well. So it must be adaptable, okay? Identify what those barriers are, and then advocates, we should focus on empowering that survivor and the fact that they have survivor-led decisions. Okay. Okay. So what are some barriers specifically to reporting? Okay. So we know that in 2015, by the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault by the University of Texas, only 9.2% of victims actually report their assault to law enforcement. Okay. And there's going to be several reasons for that. Sometimes survivors just don't feel it necessary to involve the criminal justice system. Some may even seek support through rape crisis centers or therapy and not want to involve. Some may believe that, hey, I just don't want to tell my story over again. It's too traumatizing, So there are going to be several different reasons as to why that number is very low. Okay. So if a survivor chooses to not report as an advocate, you know that, hey, that's pretty common. Okay. Now, it does depend on the relationship. So we know that for those that are actually sexually assaulted by a stranger, we have between 46% and 66% of those survivors actually report those cases. Okay. And the numbers are lowered when it comes to a friend or acquaintance assault, and of 18 to 40%. And then, of course, intimate partner or an ex, only 25% of survivors actually report the incidences. Okay. And likewise, understanding that survivors will sometimes fear that legal system, and that is a big culprit as to why those numbers are or why survivors choose not to report. So here are some specific reasons as to why survivors may choose to not report. For number one, that fear of reprisal, retaliation from the offender. Okay, so I report. Now the offender is angry with me, threatening me. They get out of jail. They're upset. They're afraid of the consequence of actually reporting them in the first place. Okay. It's one of the main reasons as to why they choose to not report. I don't want to make or escalate the situation. The police were already called, but going a step further and actually reporting this situation, cooperating with law enforcement is a big deal. Okay. Some actually believe that the police could or would do nothing to help. So they're not going to help the situation. Maybe the police were called several times out to the home and before this incident that happened, and they did nothing about it. Okay. There could be shame, stigma, and even privacy concerns. Okay. You just want to keep whatever happened to you private. Okay. You don't want anyone else to know. Then there's the fear of the justice system. So disbelief that, hey, that they'll actually do something about it, or even that secondary victimization within the systems. Okay. Hey, it's my word against their word? How are they even going to believe me? Okay, I don't really have proof or I don't really have evidence. And so I really don't feel like they can really do anything about it without that. Is my word against their word. Okay. Some are just uncertain about the perpetrator's intent. Like, oh, I don't know what's in their mind if I choose to do this. How they react, if I chose to report, or even not knowing how to report. Some survivors just don't even know where to go. How do you report? What are the options to reporting? Or even feeling like the crime was just not serious enough to actually produce criminal charges. So if they're not able to feel that there's anything that really can be done, then they may not choose to report. And then, of course, they don't want to get the offender in trouble. This is especially true with those acquaintance rapes, family members and stuff, family is family, that type of mindset as well. So we don't want to get family in trouble. Okay. So, uh, on the contrary, here are some reasons why survivors do choose to report. Okay. Within 28%, they will choose to protect themselves and their household from further crimes. Okay, so I need to report to keep my safety for me and my household. Okay, 25% may stop the assault from escalating or even reoccurring. Okay, 21% may report to just improve the police surveillance. Sometimes they'll have additional security that's out there, and so they'll feel protected with that.
Okay,
17% will report
I got
because
it.
they know that an offender is actually punished or prevented from reoffending. Okay. And then 6% have their own personal reasons, and 3% will seek help to recover from loss. Okay, so when we break down those barriers to reporting, of course, the language and cultural barriers. So when you have non-speaking, non-English speaking survivors and they're wanting to report, they may not understand how to report or even, you know, address that reporting, in their native language. Okay, they may struggle to actually write that information or even struggle to communicate with that law enforcement. Maybe the law enforcement is like, hey, we need time to be able to get a translator, and some maybe like, you know what, this is too much, and then just choose to walk away. Okay. When it comes to elderly survivors, some may choose like, I don't think anybody would believe that someone would actually choose to sexually assault me. So they don't feel like they would actually be believed. Okay. When it comes to adolescents, some fear, okay, if I actually choose to tell my parents about what actually happened to me, what are those parent consequences that may came, that overprotection that may came, the forcing to report this when they really don't want to report, or if they were using alcohol when they received sexual assault, when they were sexually assaulted and they were underage. So now they're afraid to actually say anything because they know they weren't supposed to be drinking, okay, or even drugs were involved. They also may need reassurance that consent is always required, and they don't always understand that. When it comes to men, male sexual assault is highly underreported due to stigma. Okay, that goes with those preconceived notions, misconceptions that real men can't be raped. Okay, and so and that's even addressed from sometimes law enforcement may say that when they finally choose to actually report, which may discourage them from actually seeking help. Okay. And then when it comes to the LGBTQ, of course, they fear that their sexual orientation will be overshadowing their assault. Okay. And then some survivors may experience those hate-based attacks. Okay. When it comes to those that have disabilities, they may face increased risk because they actually, especially from their caregivers, they need that caregiver, to be able to help them throughout the day. Okay. And reporting that may mean they will lose that support. Okay. When it comes to immigration, of course, fear of deportation. So if I choose to report, okay, and I'm thinking, hey, law enforcement, is saying, hey, it's okay to report. Oh, what they find out I'm undocumented. And so that fear of deportation is a big one for immigrant survivors. And then of distrustment of law enforcement or even loyalty to their own cultural group. Okay. All right, secondary victims. And so when we're working with secondary victims, especially within the hospitals, you may have, whether it's adult or children, those involved. It could be a spouse. So maybe a wife was sexually assaulted actually by a stranger, not necessarily her husband, and her husband's up there. And he's having all of these emotions because he just found out his wife was raped by another person, right? And so, secondary victims, these are people that are closest to the survivor who are emotionally impacted by the sexual assault the survivor has done. Okay. This could also include for child sexual assault, the mother would be the secondary victim. Oh my gosh, I sent my kid to daycare and they were sexually assaulted, or I sent my kid to live with their father and they came back and they may have found blood in their genitalia, the child. There's different reasons. But secondary victims, you will work with them quite often. In some cases, especially most definitely when it comes to children, child sexual assault. And so we want to go over what are some common reactions when it comes to secondary victims. Okay. So, of course, your role is to be there for the survivor, but also those secondary victims as well. Okay. They may feel helpless, right? I don't know how to actually support, the survivor. They may be angry, or have guilt, especially a mother like, why? I sent my child over there, thinking it was safe, and then this is what happened. And they may even be confused about the situation. Okay. There's also struggles in knowing how to support the survivor effectively. Okay. So they don't really know, like, how can I support this person? Um, or my child, or how can I support, as a husband, how can I support my wife when all I feel is like rage right now? There's also personal distresses that may require them having to use their own emotional support. Okay. And then challenges that are faced by significant others. So difficulty comprehending the total impact of the trauma. So, sometimes they're just like, hey, I say it's a wife and a husband, right? And so the wife was sexually assaulted by someone else. The wife may not feel like she may want to be intimate with her husband anymore following a sexual assault by a stranger, okay? Which may lead the husband into feeling rejected, okay? And they're not able to separate the fact that what happened to them, the trauma that happened to them that is different from, them being in an intimate relationship as husband and wife, okay? So there are those challenges too. There's also relationship strain, and those that happen, especially in those intimate partners, divorce is pretty common, unfortunately, because there are a lot of post-assault emotional and psychological struggles with that. Okay. And then there's also that possible resurfacing of existing family issues after the assault. The arguments happen more often, the disconnect that may happen, post-sexual assault, that could also be a factor when with significant others. So we mentioned about the high divorce and the separation rate. So understanding that could lead to certain communication breakdown and that emotional distancing. Okay. So survivors may choose to actually withdraw emotionally or even struggle with that intimacy. Okay. There are certain myths about sexual assault, that can cause like that secondary victim to misinterpret what the survivor's trauma responses may look like. Okay. In addition to, feeling guilt and blame, what are some challenges, the PTSD that may come from that, being super hyper vigilant, a survivor, remember we talked about survivors feeling like they have some sort of blame to it. Oh, I shouldn't have went out with my friends, having that blame to their sexual assault and look what it's done to me in my relationships, or even like, hey, now I have to, I was in this situation with my cousin and felt this way, and it's a whole bunch of situations. So understanding that there's some challenges even with the secondary victims as feeling guilty and blame. Well, perhaps I should have went with them. Or perhaps, I shouldn't have left them alone, understanding that as an advocate, your job is to educate significant others about the realities of trauma, right now they just might be in shock right now. They may not choose to want to talk about it, and that's okay. And also what that recovery actually may look like. Your job is also to support both the survivor and the secondary victims, which is crucial to that relationship healing. So, how can significant others actually support survivors? So, when you're talking to them, say, hey, I understand you have a bunch of emotions too, but as supporting the survivor, you want to make sure you're believing the survivor. Like, that is the number one thing. Validation is very essential. It takes a lot for a survivor. We've already seen the statistic numbers on those that report versus those that do not report. And so, validation is crucial in that. You have to be patient and understanding. Okay, healing will take time. It's not linear. They may have days where things are okay, and then they may have days where things are just not okay. And avoid pressuring them to return to whatever normal looks like pre-sexual assault. Okay. Sometimes seek education, get educated about sexual assault, what that looks like. You have brochures and pamphlets, and we also have a guide within their packet that they get. Okay. And so helping them to understand like what that trauma looks like, how it affects that person emotionally, what behavioral changes may happen and how this may impact relationships. Okay. And then encourage that professional support. Okay. If they do have options, maybe, providing getting that sexual assault crisis therapeutic services for both. Okay. It's not just only for the survivor, but the secondary victim may need that as well because remember, they have their own emotions about everything that's going on too. Okay. As an advocate, your job is to provide those resources to educate those significant others. And then sometimes there are agencies that actually facilitate support groups for secondary victims. And then also encouraging open communication in those relationships to foster understanding between the survivor and the secondary victim. So, when you're actually utilizing crisis intervention as an advocate, your two primary objectives is to support that secondary victim in their own emotional support response. We talked about how the secondary victim can have their own emotions about everything. So, helping them learn how family and friends may process their own feelings about their assault. Okay. And then address how their emotions can impact that. So you have every right to be angry about the situation. Be very mindful of that anger, what it's for, why you feel that way, and how to address that as well. Okay. And then guide support for the survivors. So equipping the family and friends with those emotional and practice support that they may need. Okay. Encouraging that positive, non-judgmental communication to aid in the recovery. Okay. Understand that sexual assault affects both the survivor, but also the secondary victims and their close circle. Okay. So using specific crisis intervention tools can help prevent secondary trauma and promote that supportive environment. So, what are some common emotional and psychological responses when it comes to secondary victims? Of course, the distress for the survivor's physical and emotional well-being. Okay, so they're stressed out. I can't believe this is happening to my spouse or my friend. Angry at the offender, like that deep anger. You may have like with sexual assault, like hey, the offender sexually assaulted my kid. You have both the parents that are up there and they're angry and they're wanting to retaliate on the offender. Okay. There's also, and it could accidentally also be misdirected toward the survivor. Okay. Sometimes there's, especially when it comes to like adolescence, like, hey, you weren't supposed to be at this party in the first place, and now this happened. So there are lots of different emotions that can happen. Frustration that the survivor actually didn't fight harder. So why did you just let them just sexually assaulted? You didn't even try to fight back, or why didn't you do more to prevent like the sexual assault? Okay. And then there's that blame and the anger that the survivor was just not careful enough. Okay. So these are very common reactions when it comes to personal responsibility and guilt. So they have a deep desire for revenge on the perpetrator. Okay. Especially when you're talking parents to child sexual assault, they have an overwhelming feeling of emotions. Okay. And they need to not feel, and then they have guilt maybe too for not being able to protect either their child or even their family member. And then that sense of loss, right? You know, that loss of trust and security that may happen, the loss that the survivor's well-being or even disruption in that family dynamic. So when it comes to supporting family and loved ones after the sexual assault, it's important to listen and have that open communication. So family and friends have to deliver that safe space um, for survivors to be able to express their emotions. Okay, understand that advocates should validate those feelings while also helping them support the survivor. Okay, we want to encourage them to have that open communication. Okay. And then, of course, that fear of not being believed. So understand that, address those concerns with both the survivor and the secondary victims. Understand that, hey, having them understand that the survivor may already feel those feelings of shame and guilt. You know, you guys both may have very similar feelings about the situation, which is why that open communication is a great help. Okay. Also, as an advocate, we want to make sure that we are dispelling certain myths about rape. Okay, so sometimes you may have survivors and secondary victims that may have those common misconceptions, like, you know, oh, well, if you didn't fight back, you must have, like, one, are you sure this is sexual assault? You know, or when it came to marital rape, how that marital rape's not a thing. Remember, some family and friends may believe that as well. And then, of course, may mean that it was just a misunderstanding. Can someone mute, please? I hear you guys. Who's that?
Okay. That white one or whatever.
Hello? All right, so let me finish up. And then encourage the survivor to communicate with pressure. So, okay, so we want to have those guiding conversations. Ask certain non-threatening questions. How are you feeling right now? You know, what is bothering you the most when it comes to encouraging the survivor to communicate? Okay. Survivors may want to talk about other things. They may not want to just talk about the assault, okay? Especially, you know, during the SANE exam, after, you know, it just depends on the survivor. If you do ask those questions and they're willing to talk, that's perfect, okay? If they're quiet and they're not really, that's okay as well, okay? So when it comes to the role of the listener is to express that willing to listen. Sometimes they don't want to hear. Sometimes they just want to be able to express their frustrations or their feelings rather than forcing certain discussions. Okay. Understand that survivors may be sensitive to their loved ones' distress and avoid talking to protect them too. A lot of secondary victims just don't know what to say, what not to say. So some may just resort to just not communicating at all, okay? And then we want to encourage them seeking support from somebody trusted if they feel like they can't be open with their family, okay? You want to also, when working with a survivor, restore that sense of control. So avoid pressuring the survivor to talk. When you're explaining that to the secondary victim, they may not want to talk, especially about the actual situation, dive into detail. Keep in mind, for instance, if they choose to report, they already have to tell their story so many times. So when you're as a secondary victim, they may not necessarily want to actually communicate that, okay? Allow the survivor to actually choose the when and the where and to who they actually want to open up to. Okay. Understand that that sexual assault took away their sense of control. So right now we are working on rebuilding that client autonomy. So when it comes to balancing that support without actually overprotecting, remember, overprotection is very common when it comes to family and friends, because now they're like, hey, this situation happened to my significant other or family member, and now I just want to protect them. Okay. Understand that sometimes there are certain religious and cultural barriers. Some families may even struggle with the religious guilt and believing that, oh, okay, the survivor was sexually assaulted, so they have sinned. Okay. And that belief can be very damaging. So understand that families must reject that blame on the survivor. There's a period of grief and healing. So understand that the trauma recovery process often mirrors grief after you losing a loved one. Okay. So they will necessarily go through those 7 steps of grief. Okay. Understand suppressing the survivor's emotions can be harmful. So if you don't offer a safe space for them to be able to explore their feelings, that can be more harmful. Okay. Understand that being silent and being in denial do not erase the trauma. Okay. So it doesn't necessarily fix anything, but you want to be mindful that whoever it is, they may want to talk when they feel comfortable talking. Okay. When it comes to that overprotecting, so, we understand why overprotection is a thing. We understand why families do want to overprotect, but understand that shielding the survivor from the world is not going to fix anything. Okay. It actually reinforces the idea that the survivor is actually powerless rather than actually empowering them to actually overcome what they went through. Okay. In addition to survivors must gradually regain that independence. Okay. So, learning to trust what their own instincts are, learning to not be afraid of being outside or even if the sexual assault happened in a party, eventually they might want to maybe have a social relationship later on in life. We don't want them to create this notion of being in a bubble for the rest of their lives too. Okay. And then addressing the family guilt. So understand that the significant others may blame themselves, like, hey, if I had been there, then this wouldn't have happened. Know that self-blaming yourself is not helpful, okay? It actually increases anxiety and actually shifts focus away from the survivor actually healing. So, as an advocate, when you're supporting families, there are certain educational responsibilities. So, explaining the maliciousness of sexual assault, that it is the perpetrator's full fault. There's nothing that the survivor did, it's nothing that they wore. We want to help eliminate that self blame and the misplaced guilt. And then also prepare families for how the survivors' psychological and physiological responses may look like. It's very common for them to develop PTSD or anxiety, or even be very depressed after the assault. They may have trouble sleeping, nightmares, all of that, and even mood swings. So educating the survivor and the secondary victim on, the importance of just trying to be patient as best as possible and understanding. Okay. Teaching how to create that safe and accepting environment. So, survivors will need that judgment-free space. They'll need that. They need to feel like you will actually listen to them without criticism. Okay. There are going to be changes sometimes in sexual dynamics, especially with partners or relationships, where the relationship partner isn't the offender. Okay. So they can help, your partners identify what those emotional and physical shifts are and how it actually impacts the survivor. And then, of course, the pre-existing issues that happens in a relationship. So if the survivor and their partner were already having sexual incompatibility issues before, encourage that open dialogue between both partners in that relationship. Okay. Help them understand that healing requires communication, not avoidance. So, as an advocate, your job is to acknowledge the partner's emotional injuries. So let them know that as a secondary victim, they have suffered a loss as well. Okay. So they, because knowing that your partner, friend, whatever the case, relationship that may be, they're going to be different after the sexual assault. Okay. So in some ways, it can be very life-changing to some survivors. Offer reassurance. Okay, so while the trauma right now is painful, it doesn't have to be permanently debilitating. Like this is very recent, it just happened. It will take time to heal. And then encourage mutual support. So rely on one another for that healing. Okay. We will also provide those resources and educational material on more about sexual assault, on how secondary victims actually can support sexual assault survivors too. And then making sure that survivors feel that you genuinely care and offer that compassion. Okay. And then if it means they do also have to provide gender specific counseling options, if you aren't familiar with that, then you could always say, hey, They could call 211, or you could go on Psychology Today to find, a male counselor for male survivors, or, even if, a female survivor may want a female counselor, or even cultural specific or religious specific counselors. Okay. So we want to make sure that we are gender and culturally sensitive to what the survivor needs. All right, so avoid these common pitfalls when you're an advocate, okay? Do not be openly critical, okay? You should not say statements like, if the secondary victim is very angry, I just want to kill him, right? I just want to hurt him. These are very valid feelings. You should not tell them you shouldn't feel that way, okay? Being angry is bad, or, this is not helpful, you acting like this right now. We want to avoid those statements, okay? This could cause additional defensiveness when it comes to the secondary victim, and also shut down meaningful conversation where now they don't even feel comfortable talking to you and expressing those feelings to you. All right. Making sure you're not dismissing the partner or the family member's feeling. Okay. Their emotional pain is real. Okay. Also, don't frame healing as forgetting. So understand that survivors and their families will never erase the trauma that happened. Okay, but they can choose to move forward after the situation has happened. Okay. Don't ignore the need for individualized support. So sometimes the survivor may just want that individual support. The secondary victim may want their own support. They may want family counseling if it pertains to them, and they may want partner counseling if that pertains to them. Okay. So just understand that they can adapt those support strategies in whatever way that they want to heal and what healing looks like for them. So why is support important when we're talking? So when we're supporting survivors, we know that they often struggle with discussing their experience. So when we're talking about ways to offer that, you have to be willing to listen, okay? Be patient. Sometimes just let them talk it out if they want to. That trauma is very difficult, okay? And we want to make sure that they feel safe with you, which can encourage them to actually talk about their situation. Okay. But understand that respect their choice. Okay. So if they do not want to report, they do not want to talk or communicate, that's okay as well. Understand that when survivors have to rebuild that sense of control, remember that sense of control was taken from them in the sexual assault. We need to encourage that decision making is at their own pace. Okay. Remember, the rapist took away their client autonomy, they took away their right, and they need to learn how they can regain control after sexual assault. Okay. So, how can we help them with learning how to provide stability? Okay. Reassure them that, I understand your sexual assault was terrible, okay? But understand the real you is still there, okay? You're not a broken person, you're not ruined for life. You are someone that went through a very terrible experience, okay? Offer that calm, stable, and secure presence in their life. So making sure that they feel calm, letting them know what resources are available for them to be able to feel additional support. Okay. Avoid pressuring them into any actions they're not ready for. That includes the SANE exam. So if they're not comfortable with that, that's okay too. Okay. Survivors need to feel safe again. They need to feel like they have a safe space to explore their feelings, and even feeling safe with the advocate there as well. Okay. Our aim is to empower, not control. All right, so some male survivors, well, if you have male survivors that you're on a crisis call, understand that male survivors may react differently as opposed to female survivors, okay? A lot of male survivors offer more controlled emotional responses. So we want to make sure when we are on those calls, we aren't looking at their ability to not look like a quote unquote emotional distraught survivor, okay? Because they aren't going to display in most cases that way, okay? They also may be less inclined to actually talk specifically about their trauma, but we want to encourage conversation if they do feel up to it. Understand that, hey, I'm your advocate. I'm here to communicate with you, support you in ways that you may want, but, just let me know what you need. Never force them to disclose additional stuff that is very sensitive to them. Understand that everyone processes trauma differently. Okay. So you may have a survivor where male, female, doesn't matter, LGBTQ, it doesn't matter. Everyone processes trauma very different. Some may cry, and some may just be very detached, you know. Some may even want to talk, okay, while others might prefer silence, okay. We need to make sure we are avoiding judgment, whatever, you know, their response is, okay. So whatever their reaction is, avoid that judgment, okay. Every survivor, how they respond is valid, okay. Understand that the support should be adaptable, non-judgmental, and of course, most important, survivor-centered, okay? And the best way to help do this is just to be patient, be open, and of course, emotionally available. All right, we are finished. We are finished. Thank you guys so much for everything. All right, I will be loading more videos onto our YouTube channel. Please make sure you go ahead and start watching. I've gotten a few emails already from people who have been watching the videos, and I've been writing them off in your list. I will be uploading more. Okay. If you have any questions, just let me know. Okay. You guys have a good rest of your day.